So today is Passion Sunday, and in the history of the church, the people of God have celebrated or remembered. It's kind of weird to say we celebrate, but we do. But we remember Christ's death and resurrection, and mostly his death, his suffering and death on the cross, on either Passion Sunday or Good Friday. And since we rent out this facility, we decided to do it on Sunday. And today we're going to talk about the worst day ever, really, when you think about it. One of the worst days you could think about. And as we start to reflect about that, what are some of your worst days ever? I have no idea if anybody's going to share anything here, but I thought I'd ask that question. Yeah. Wow. And you almost lost him. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so the little boy has a seizure, grandson, almost lost him. Yeah, that's a pretty bad day. That's a pretty bad day. Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts there? When Dad died. Yeah. For a lot of people, that's worst day ever. Right. Eva? Wow. Yeah. Nephew committed suicide. Yeah, that's bad. Yeah, that's hit me because last night at 2 in the morning I got a phone call from a relative of mine saying, hey, this other person who's a relative is suicidal. He's breaking down, and his parents are pleading with him not to take his life, So that's a bad day, right? Anybody else? Anybody else? What was that? The day your little brother died, right? Sibling, right? A spouse, a child, right? A parent dying, right? Days can be rough sometimes. We can be in pretty bad places. Maybe your bad day was in the past, right? You know exactly when you were fired, when you lost him, when she walked out, when life seemed to crumble. Maybe the worst days is actually something you're dreading. Like maybe you have someone like me that's continually suicidal, and you're just dreading that phone call, right? Dreading that day when something's going to happen. Or maybe dad or mom or husband or wife is struggling with cancer, and you're going to get that call one day that they're no more, I think we all have bad days, and really days that we could call the worst. It's very clear, very definitive. This was or this will be the day that shakes my very soul, the day that reality seems to crumble, the day when things seem lost, when faith seems to fade away, right? Now the disciples were having a pretty bad day as well, and so was Jesus when it comes to our reading. Let's turn to Luke 9. I'm sorry, this is John 19. It's on page 827 or on page 744, depending on whether you have one of our new Bibles or old Bibles. And unfortunately, we haven't tagged them yet. We should, so you don't have to figure out which one it is by turning to the wrong page. So page 827 or 744. John chapter 19. So I want you to think about before we read this reading, what the disciples were doing at this time, where they'd been. Jesus had come in and he started to call disciples to follow him. That is, people who would follow Jesus, learn to think like Jesus thought, learn to speak like Jesus spoke, and learn to live as Jesus lived. And they spent 3 years following this man, doing those things. They gave up their families, they gave up their inheritance, they gave up their homes, and they followed this man on the hope that he was the one who was going to rescue Israel, the one who was going to renew and redeem their people. And they'd been following him for those 3 years. They didn't know what they were going to eat each day. They didn't know where they were going to sleep. They followed him from town to town, from village to village, and it was a rough life, right? And everybody knew who they were, that they were followers of Jesus. And then leading up to then our reading, the week before on that Sunday, what we usually call Palm Sunday, right? Jesus is coming into the city of Jerusalem, the main city of Israel. And it's here in Jerusalem that they're going to celebrate the Passover, the greatest act of God in the Old Testament in saving his people, in rescuing them from slavery and bondage to the Egyptians, and bringing them into the land of promise, where they would have a hope and a future. And every year the Jewish people celebrated this tradition. And so Jesus and his followers are going to Jerusalem, and they're with a great band of people coming from Jericho. And all these people are singing the Psalms, singing songs about going to the Passover, singing songs about God's salvation, singing songs about the Messiah, that is God's promised rescuer, coming. And as they come to the city, suddenly they're singing these songs about Jesus. And they're taking palm branches and they're waving them in the air like flags. And they elevate him up on a donkey, and they throw their coats down before him. And they're saying things like, "Blessed be the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the Son of David," that is the King, the heir to the kingdom. They're saying, "This man we want as king. This man we give our allegiance to. We're going to follow Jesus." And think about how good the disciples felt at this point. They're like, finally, these 3 years paid off. It's about time. We've been waiting for quite a while. And now there's going to be a regime change. Now Jesus is going to be in control, the good king, and he'll make things right for us. He's going to rescue us from our slavery to the Romans, who were occupying Israel at that point. And then Thursday comes along, and they start celebrating the Passover meal. And they're still filled with joy. They're saying, now we're remembering how God rescued his people through the Passover lamb. And what they did there is that as they left Israel, if you remember that story, God asked each family to kill a lamb, a perfect lamb, a spotless lamb, and take its blood and put it over the doorposts and the sides of the door. And so when the angel of death came over Egypt, death would pass over any house that had the innocent blood of the lamb on it. Anyone whose house was covered by the blood of the lamb, the innocent blood, the angel of death said that person is innocent, they don't deserve to die. And so they celebrated then by eating a lamb at every Passover, reenacting in a way that part of that great saving act of God. And so as they're remembering that, they're probably thinking even more, Jesus is going to rescue us, right? Joyous time, the greatest festival. It's kind of like, you could say Easter for us, but even more so Christmas. The greatest festival of the Jewish year. I mean, they'd be filled with such wonderful feelings about God and country and family as they were together. And then Jesus changes the tone. He starts talking about him being a Passover lamb. He being the one who would shed his blood and give his body to rescue the people. He starts saying that one of his very own disciples would betray him and that he would die. He says he's going somewhere where the disciples cannot follow. He's leaving them. That evening, then they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus wants them to stay up and to pray with him, but each of them falls asleep over and over again. And he's left alone, pleading with his Father, is there another way? Is there another way that we can rescue the people of this world, to win back your children? And then he says, but your will be done, God. Your will be done, Dad, not mine. Let's continue with the plan. And then Judas, one of his disciples, comes, betrays him with a kiss, and the Roman soldiers, the temple guards, take Jesus away. And he's put on kind of a mock trial. False charges are thrown against him. And the Jewish leaders of the day, the religious leaders, strike him. They mock him. They strip him. They put a purple robe on him, push a crown of thorns on his head, give him a little rod to be his scepter of rule, and say, "Hail to the King of the Jews," as they spit on him and strike him. He's brought before the Roman governor, and the governor can't find any fault with him. Yet feeling pressure from the leaders of the Jewish people and fearing a rebellion, he has Jesus mercilessly flogged, whipped with a cat of nine tails, which is 9 strands of leather with bone and metal woven into it, and it just tears and rips his back apart. This beating often killed prisoners. And then he's brought before the people, and the governor, Pontius Pilate, says, it's your tradition on Passover to let someone go, someone who's been in prison, to set them free as God set people free. And I'll give you an option. Jesus, your king, the innocent one, or Barabbas, a known rebel who fought against Roman rule, who was kind of like a terrorist. And he says, who will you choose, the rebel or the innocent one? And they say, we want the rebel. Let him go. He says, what should we do with Jesus? They yell, crucify him. Crucify him. So that's where our reading picks off here. John 19, verse 16. It says, under the heading, the crucifixion, it says, so they took Jesus away, carrying the cross by himself on his back. He went to the place called Place of the Skull. In Hebrew, it's known as Golgotha. There they nailed him to the cross. 2 others were crucified with him, one on either side, with Jesus between them. And Pilate posted a sign over him that read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so that many people could read it. Then the leading priests objected and said to Pilate, change it from the King of the Jews to, he said, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate replied, no, what I have written, I have written. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they divided his clothing among the 4 of them. They also took his robe, but it was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. And so they said, rather than tearing it apart, let us throw dice for it. This fulfilled the scripture that says, they divided my garments among themselves and threw dice for my clothing. So that is what they did. Standing near the cross were Jesus' mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother standing there beside the disciple he loved, he said to her, "Dear woman, here is your son." And he said to this disciple, "Here is your mother." And from then on, the disciple took her mother into his home. Jesus knew that his mission was now finished. And to fulfill Scripture, he said, "I am thirsty." And a jar of sour wine was sitting there. So they soaked a sponge in it, put it on a hyssop branch, and held it up to his lips. And when Jesus had tasted it, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and released his spirit. It was a day of preparation, and the Jewish leaders didn't want the bodies hanging there the next day, which was the Sabbath, and a very special Sabbath because it was Passover. So they asked Pilate to hasten their deaths by ordering that their legs be broken. Then their bodies could be taken down. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the two men crucified with Jesus. But they came to Jesus and they saw that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers, however, pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out. This report is from an eyewitness giving an accurate account. He speaks the truth so that you can believe. These things happen to fulfill the Scriptures that say, "Not one of his bones will be broken," and they will look on the one that they pierced. They go on and share how Jesus was buried by two rich men in a rich man's tomb after that. And so John the Apostle, who was the disciple that Jesus loved there, kind of his best friend, you could say, says at the end of this that he witnessed this. He saw this with his own eyes. And so he's the only disciple out of the men who stayed. And so you see, he witnessed Jesus scourged beyond recognition. He didn't even look human. He was so disfigured. He saw the hands of Jesus, hands that he so willingly and lovingly reached out to the poor, oppressed and hurting, be pinned to the tree on Calvary. He saw that back which Jesus lifted up the little children and carried them upon, just torn apart with those whips. He saw the loving eyes that Jesus gazed upon those people that he cared so deeply about, swollen and shut. He saw his friendly smile stained with blood, his lips, which he spoke the most compelling words of any man of history, broken open and swollen and bleeding. And he saw the heart, which had the greatest love out of anyone who ever lived, that has captivated the minds of people for the last 2,000 years, be pierced and be poured out and drained right in front of him. What do you think he felt at that moment? After all of that. That all of his work was gone? Yeah. Yeah. Wasted the last 3 years of my life. Despair. Yeah, why? Loss of hope, right? Kind of like losing your religion. It's probably what he felt in many ways. Because he had come to believe that this was even the Son of God. This man that he saw die. Yeah, anything else? Yeah, Martha. What was that? Confusion. Oh, yeah. A lot of confusion. Why is that? Yeah. Yeah, they had a different narrative playing out in their minds on what Jesus was going to do. All right? So it was confusing for them. Martha, were you going to say something? Defeated. Yeah. Yeah, defeated. Yeah. What do you think Jesus meant when he said, "It is finished," before he died? The suffering. Yeah. Okay. Oh, the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. Yeah. Yeah, this is chock full of Old Testament prophecy. I could pull up probably about 10 different prophecies that all are fulfilled in this one passage. Yeah. The actual act of salvation. Yeah. How else could it be read, though, when he said it is finished? Could be a cry of despair, right? It's over. My life is done. My mission, I want to change the world. It's going to be forgotten. It's not going to work. Right? Depending on what you believe about Jesus depends on how you view those words. And many of you are Christians already, and so you know that there are that aspect of this is his saving work. But during the days of Jesus, and even today, there's a lot of people who see Jesus in different ways, right? During Jesus' day, some wanted him as king, some wanted him dead, right? Which actually happened. They got what they wanted. Some thought him as a prophet. Some thought of him as the devil himself, right? And some thought he was a good but misdirected man. And others saw him as something so much more, right? And who is Jesus? That's really what is at the center of what happens on Good Friday and what happens on Easter. Who is Jesus, right? If he's a man and a good teacher, his death means little, right? It's tragic, actually. The tragic end of a good life, and it's him saying it is finished is just a last word of despair, right? But if he is who he says he is, right? If he's who he claimed to be, if he is what the eyewitnesses says he was as well, and the historical records record of him, then the words, "it is finished," is actually a declaration of victory, of mission accomplished, of I did what I set out to do, right? Now, we sometimes have a hard time understanding that because most religions and most philosophies are based off of what someone says, right? The words that they spoke, right? Hinduism is based off of the Upanishads and the Vedas. Buddhism is based off of the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. Islam is based off of the teachings of Muhammad. Judaism, in many ways, is based off of just the teachings of Moses for the most part, right? But Christianity is different. True Christianity is radically different than every other religion out there, every other philosophy that is based off of people's words. Christianity is based off of someone's actions. That's why historically most churches have professed faith in creeds. And if you remember our series from when we started back in September and October, our identity series, we went through the Apostles' Creed, and it didn't say anything about what Jesus taught, but it was all about what Jesus did and who he was, right? And what he did validates every word he spoke. Right? That's why I believe this book. because there's eyewitness testimonies that say he rose from the dead on Easter Sunday. And so I believe that, right? But what did his death do for us? How does his death start to repair our worst of days? Flip back to page 559 or 503. We're on Isaiah 53. Page 559 or page 503. And actually, we'll go back just a few verses into 52. Isaiah 52, verse 13. It says, "See, my servant will prosper. He will be highly exalted." This is the one time that this version I don't like because it says high and lifted up in the Greek, which gives you a picture of the cross of Calvary there. It says, "But many were amazed when they saw him. His face was so disfigured he seemed hardly human, and from his appearance one would scarcely know he was a man. And he will startle many nations. Kings will stand speechless in his presence, and they will see." Man, this one always breaks me up. I don't know why, but this passage just touches my heart. It says, "For they will see what they had not been told, and they will understand what they had not heard about." So kings will come to know of him after this event. It says, "Who has believed our message? To whom has the Lord revealed his powerful arm? My servant grew up in the Lord's presence like a tender green shoot, like a root in dry ground. There was nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. We turned our back on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. Yet it was our weakness he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's paths to follow our own. Yet the Lord has laid on him the sins of us all." What does this tell you about people, about us? Self-centered? How so? Yeah. We've all given up God's path to follow our own. Right? We all said, "God, we don't want you as king, as our good dad directing our lives. We want to strike out on our own, control our own destiny, make our own way." What else does this say about us, about people? Yeah, we'll get there. Let's answer the question first. I appreciate that question, but we'll get there, buddy. We're unfaithful. How does this reading say that? Yeah. Yeah, God's clearly set out how we should live, what we should do with our lives, but we choose our own way. We strike out our own path. Yeah. What else does this say about us? Anything else? We have no compassion. How so? Yeah. Yeah, we turn our backs on him. In fact, the people of Jesus' day, all those people who praised him, who welcomed him as king, walked away at that point. Right? Even the disciples turned their backs on him and ran away. John was the only one who stood. The rest ran, cowered. Yeah, Martha? Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So we're all like sheep, and Martha was saying that if you ever have had sheep before, that they really wander. They go after that next piece of green grass, and they don't really stay organized and stay where they should unless the shepherd calls them. Right? And the shepherd protects them and looks after them. Any other thing about us from this passage? What does it call us? Weak? Okay. Yeah, we were weak. Yeah. What else does it call us? Uncaring and unbelieving to a certain point. Yeah.
Kind of shallow people. We look for the next shiny thing, the blingy thing, and we don't see things that are normal
Yeah.
that are right in front of us. We just pay attention to.
Yeah. We're shallow. We look to the next great thing, right? This guy's not our hero. Maybe somebody else will be. But it calls us rebels here a handful of times, right? Because of our rebellion, our fighting against our rightful God, our rightful King, our rightful Father, right? What does it tell you about Jesus, though? What does it tell you about who he is and what he's done? Yeah. I love that. I love that he came as an ordinary dude. Right? He didn't have anything special about him, wasn't necessarily charismatic or great looking. I feel a little bad about the Jesus that I had on our Pray Like Jesus graphic because he was pretty good looking. And that's what they always put on the movies and stuff. He's like, you know, Jim Caviezel Jesus, right? But he was just an ordinary guy. Didn't look special necessarily. Anything else? He had an unearthly commitment to those who he loved. Yeah. Great passion for those people he loved. What else? What was that? He fought for us. How so? Yeah. Isn't that crazy? Like, people looked at him on that cross and they said, that is capital punishment right there. It's like being in an electric chair. And they're saying, that man deserves that because he's a rebel. That's what the people thought who were killing him. But in reality, he was doing what? He was carrying our rebellion. He was suffering for our sins, for all of our mistakes. Right? He voluntarily took on the worst day. That word excruciating, which you sometimes use to describe some pain you're in, that actually means out of the cross. And it's a new word that was invented because of the cross, because nothing could compare or describe the pain that came with crucifixion. It was the most painful way to die. And he did that for you and for me. Right? He literally became an enemy of the state and died as a rebel so that all of us who are rebels against God, who live as enemies against him, could be pardoned, could be cleared, could be forgiven. Right? He stood in our place and experienced the rejection of God and humanity, the rejection of his position as a son of God. He gave that up, right? And he hung there naked, no possessions, nothing on him, most likely. He bled out for you and for me. And because of that, we're forgiven. Because of that one act, we see that the payment is made. Right? All of the debt that we have to God because of the way that we mistreat one another, the ways that we mistreat God, the way that we take authority that we're not supposed to have in this life, the way that we relinquish our responsibilities, all the hurtful things that we've ever done, all the hurtful thoughts that we've ever thought, every moment of pride and arrogance, every unkind word that came from our mouth. He hung there for us. He experienced the deepest of pains. And so we know what? He can identify with us in our worst days. He knows what we're going through. We also know then we have a promise that one day, because of his worst day, will come the greatest day. When we'll stand before him, new bodies, new souls, made clean, made whole. Our worst days won't be remembered. And we'll live forever with him, forgiven, loved, and accepted by the Father because of his perfect life that he lived in our stead and his perfect death that he died for you and for me. Then we know that that's accepted because next weekend we're celebrating what? Easter. The fact that he rose from the grave. And we're celebrating with the hundreds of people who saw him in the flesh after he rose. And we're celebrating with the entire church, all that have ever come before us, who have placed their hope in him as the one man who defeated death, who defeated that worst thing that can ever happen in our lives, to our loved ones and to ourselves. He defeated on Good Friday so that we would never have to fear death, but we could live forever with him. He's also celebrating with the people who came before him. This passage is written about 600 years before Jesus lived, and it in details describes what he did and what it meant long before he ever came and stepped foot on this earth. It also fulfills many prophecies in the Psalms and the other prophets that detail clearly the different events that happened there, which is why we can believe that what he did was true, because he fulfilled prophecies that came before. We see from eyewitnesses, even up to 500 at once, that he was risen, that he defeated death. Now, if all of this is true, if we really believed this, how would that change our lives? How would that affect those worst days? In the midst of the worst days, time maybe years after the worst days. We know there's still hope. Yeah. Yeah. There's hope. What else? Yeah, Carolyn. Yeah. Yeah, there's promises in there. Jesus will succeed in his task, right? And in our worst days, it's hard to see that. It's hard to see it. But we hold on to the promises of God. We cling tight to them and know that a better day is coming. Right? I love that Mumford and Sons song where he says, there will come a day you'll see with no more tears. Right? Love will not break your heart, but will cast out fears. Right? And that's based off of this story. Right? That one day we're promised that because of his death we're free. And so we don't dwell on the worst of days. We look forward to the best of days. We remember the worst day that happened, the death of God, the death of his innocent son. And we remember that because it had purpose, because it was his plan, it blooms into the best of days on Easter, the day when we are free, the day we are forgiven, and the day that we too are assured that we live forever.